Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Rosa and Rubini podcast, Making Sense of This World. My name is Manas Chavla, and as always, I'm really pleased to be joined by Brunella Rosa, CEO and Head of Research. There's a lot going on, and we'll touch on a few different things, but we want to cover the sort of big international development of the week, specifically the G7 summit, which is happening in Japan, in Hiroshima.
Yeah,
Brunello, let's step back. I mean, we've just seen some elections in Turkey. We've seen some new developments in the Russia-Ukraine war. Could you summarize some of those sort of recent occurrences and what significance they have in the lead up to this big conference?
sure. So we have, as you said, a very important G7 summit in Hiroshima, and lots of things will be discussed. And clearly, there's lots on our plate at the moment. We just had the first round of the Turkish presidential election that, as we saw, ended up with sort of tie between Erdogan and his opponents. They will go both to the second round on the 28th of May. The fact that Erdogan was forced somehow to go into the second round is already a bit of a shake-up in the Turkish system, even if the opposition people that kind of joined all the forces in order to beat Erdogan after so many years in power were hoping for a better result. But we will see in a couple of weeks what's the result of the presidential election is, although we already know that the parliamentary election has resulted in somehow a status quo in which Erdogan's party and the MHP coalition will maintain the majority in parliament. Second thing that, of course, is occurring is war in Ukraine, counteroffensive apparently by the Ukrainian ongoing, although there are mixed reports on whether this is actually occurring or not. But to some extent, it seems that something is happening in the Bakhmut area again. And Zelensky went to Rome to meet with Pope Francis. And of course, didn't miss the chance to meet with the Italian president, Prime Minister Mattarella and Meloni. But the really significant meeting was with Pope Francis, who's been trying to foster a sort of secret peace plan fostered by the Vatican diplomacy. Finally, clearly there are still ongoing tensions in the banking system in the US and to some extent also in Europe, and therefore that would definitely be also part of the economic agenda of the G7 together with the debt ceiling standoff that we are seeing in the US.
Right. I mean, the G7's in Japan. Is that an interesting choice of location? What significance does that have?
Yeah, I mean, it's in Japan and of all places in Hiroshima that, as we know, was one of the two cities that was destroyed by the atomic bombs dropped by the Americans in 1945 at the end of the war. And then Japan clearly was at the time an enemy of the US, and of course also an enemy of China. And now things have changed dramatically. Japan is one of the closest allies of the US in the region, is part of the Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue together with US, India, and Australia, and is also the center of territorial disputes with China in the East China Sea. And so there's nowhere better, I would say, where to discuss effectively all the pieces of the jigsaw of the new world order that is emerging.
Right. I mean, we also saw sort of the surfacing of this concept, de-risking, and suggestions that Germany might be sort of compelled to adopt that. Tell me a bit more about what de-risking means, and does that have anything to do with effectively decoupling?
Yeah, so we have talked several times about the war, the Cold War between US and China ongoing, and people talk about the decoupling, meaning that US and China will go separate ways. Clearly, they have hard time working together at this stage. And Macron, French president, and Scholz, the German chancellor, went to visit Beijing in the last few weeks. We reported about this in our newsletter, and they kind of try to convince Xi, first of all, to make this phone call to Zelensky that eventually occurred, but also to make sure that the economic and commercial ties between China and Europe remain open. But then Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the EU Commission, accompanied Macron to Beijing. And there was clearly a difference in tones between Macron and von der Leyen. Macron was much more open, and he came back with very controversial remarks on the fact that Europe shouldn't be a vassal of the US and should only pursue its own strategic interests, while von der Leyen mentioned for the first time the need of de-risking, meaning Europe not relying so much on the Chinese-led global supply chains. And now it seems that the German government, from which, of course, she comes, is adopting the same language. So smart de-risking, they call it. In our view, okay, that's a nice way of putting it. So speaking about de-risking instead of decoupling, but in our view, it's just a softer version of decoupling. This is like the first step. You start de-risking, so you make sure you're not fully dependent on the Chinese global supply chains, but you end up decoupling together with the US.
I see. So there's still sort of a lot to watch for, especially, in the case of these summits, often the kind of decisions as part of the sort of grand speeches by leaders are well prepared in advance, but so often the real action happens on the sidelines, which we only come to know about sort of in the coming weeks. So it's a situation we'll watch keenly because of all the many sort of areas that it touches. As always, Brunello, thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you very much. Until next time.